Welcome. I'm Donald Smith, the chair of the annual Benjamin Franklin birthday celebration. This is Dr. Franklin's 315th birthday, and we celebrate this year with a new online format. This week, we also celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday and the seating of a new president of the United States. It's easy to talk about the disintegration of trust in American institutions. It's Franklinian to talk about restoring confidence in those institutions. We want to thank our supporters for this year's celebration. In particular, our thanks to Merck, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the newly formed Franklin Project in Washington, D.C. Our speakers today will be presented with handcrafted pens made from the trees surrounding Franklin's grave in Philadelphia, crafted by histpens.com. So, before introducing our speakers, let us begin with a 3-minute overview of our organization and the history of the Franklin celebrations. Benjamin Franklin was the great American. He aspired to move society forward, and we want to continue that concept. What can we do to help improve society?
Franklin's legacy is reflected in the libraries, the universities, the philosophical societies that he founded because he saw a need. But I think most importantly, his legacy is reflected in the spirit of inquiry and the spirit of curiosity.
Particularly now, I think we're lacking in forums and institutions to really grapple with hard questions, whether it be issues of racism or issues of criminal justice, healthcare, education. What inspired me about the celebration was it was about ideas. What are the important issues facing our country and our world now?
Every year, we come together as a way to honor some of the people who've really excelled in their field. From income inequality, where we honored Anne Case and Sir Angus Deaton, observing the world around us with Edward O. Wilson, women and their role in improving society, and we honored Linda Greenhouse and Cokie Roberts.
As a scientist, I spent a lot of time going to basic science meetings where we discussed the details of science. This was a broader picture. It was the influence of science, not just in our community, but in this country and in this world. It's just a wonderful educational experience. It's a celebration of science. It's a celebration of reason.
One of the incredible things about Ben Franklin was that he wasn't just a scientist for other scientists. He was a scientist to improve the civic good, a scientist for the people.
I often think about Franklin, and if he were here today, or if he were to suddenly appear, what would he think?
He would be amazed at how long we live, how healthy we are, that we can live easily 70, 80, some people 100 years of age. I mean, it was really science and technology that allowed that to happen. Yet at the same time, I think he would be struck by how willing we are to set aside science, to just see it just as another voice in the room, instead of a central truth.
What you see with Franklin is not being satisfied with what is currently in the present, right? I think he was always asking questions, always exploring, always trying to find something deeper. I think he would firmly believe that it's within our ability to solve many of the problems that we're facing today.
Whether it was through his inventions, whether it was through criminal justice reform, whether it was through diplomacy, Franklin would strive to do more. I think there's so much from his life from which we can learn. I would like to introduce Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, for introductory remarks and as the moderator for the morning session. Jeffrey.
Thank you so much, Don. And it is a great honor to moderate this important commemoration of the 315th birthday of Benjamin Franklin. Friends, this is a time when trust in American institutions is being threats that it has not seen in our lifetime. What can Benjamin Franklin's example teach us about the path forward? It is urgently important to remember that Franklin believed that the question of whether we could keep a republic, as he famously said, was an open one, and it would depend on the virtue of citizens and our representatives. Franklin said in Poor Richard, "Virtue and happiness are mother and daughter." He believed, like the other founders, that only by mastering our unreasonable passions, such as ambition, avarice, anger, and jealousy, could we be guided by the reason that was necessary to achieve personal and political self-government. No founder is more inspiring than Franklin about the central duty that all of us have as citizens to cultivate virtue. In his autobiography, he writes that it was about this time I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I grew convinced that truth, sincerity, and integrity in dealing between man and man were of the utmost importance to the felicity of life, and I formed written resolutions to practice them while I lived. Friends, it is meaningful to try to practice Franklin's 13 virtues ourselves and to attempt his bold system of everyday doing a checklist of how we fare in upholding the 13 virtues he identified, inspired by Pythagoras' golden virtues. They are temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, chastity, and humility. And the humility injunction is imitate Jesus and Socrates. This was not only a life lesson, although it was indeed that, but was also a project for political success. Franklin thought that unless we can ensure that we're guided not by our selfish or unreasonable passions, using the distinction that he took from Aristotle and Plato and that had been refined by John Locke and Francis Hutcheson and the Enlightenment philosophers that inspired him, unless we can master our selfish passions, which lead us to form into factions, which can culminate in violent mobs, which the framers most feared, the vision of violent mobs storming government buildings, and Shays' Rebellion in Western Massachusetts was their greatest nightmare. Unless we, the people, can muster that virtue and self-government, then we will not be capable of democratic and political self-government. So that is why it is so urgently important each year to honor Franklin, but especially this one, and to remind ourselves that although it is necessary to have a national project of resurrecting the guardrails of the Constitution that have been eroded and that have made it more difficult to slow down deliberation, to convince our representatives to think in a way that is sober and guided by reason rather than passion. That is a project of democratic renewal that citizens of all perspectives I know will be committed to, but it's also a question of personal renewal. And in both projects, we can be guided by Franklin's inspiring example. Thank you so much, and I'm very much looking forward to moderating this meaningful celebration. Back to you, Don.
I would like to introduce Dr. Margaret Levy, who is the director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. She's also Professor Emerita of International Studies at the University of Washington and is the former chair of the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. She is the general editor of the Cambridge Studies in Comparative Politics. She's the author of numerous articles and books, several focused on trust in government, with one titled Cooperation Without Trust. She's investigated the conditions under which people come to believe that their governments are legitimate. Dr. Levy's Philadelphia connections include a degree from Bryn Mawr College. Dr. Levy.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and to celebrate Benjamin Franklin's birthday at this very important moment in American history. Let's start the slides, if we could, please. So trust is really about a relationship. It's relational. A trusts B to do C. And then what's crucial here are the judgments about B, the person in whom we are investing our trust. Does B have my interest at heart? Is B competent to do what she promises to do? And does she actually keep her promises? Trustworthiness, which is what I'm largely interested in, is more about the objective attributes of individuals or institutions that give us reasons to believe that they are capable of those judgments and will actually act according to them, that they are worthy of our trust. For government, that means is government competent and able to keep its promises? Will it deliver promised goods and services? And does it do so according to standards of procedural justice of the time? Next slide, please. Legitimacy refers to the accepted and widely shared justifications for government selection and actions, something we have not seen so much of recently, based on moral principles and beliefs. So trustworthiness is more about process, and legitimacy is more about the values, including the values embodied in the process. Next slide. So I want to turn to some evidence about this. Surveys we'll start with. They're useful for revealing attitudes and opinions, but frankly, behavior, at least in my view, is what ultimately matters. That includes voting, cooperation and compliance, and of course the opposites, non-voting out of resistance, non-compliance to a variety of government policies, and even active rebellion. Next slide, please. So what you're seeing here is what you probably already know and have seen many times, is that according to surveys, public trust in government is near historic lows. This is a question that has been given since the late 1950s about the percent who trust the government in Washington always or most of the time to do the right thing. Next slide. I wanted to put the US in some perspective here. This comes from the Edelman surveys, trust surveys barometer. And I've circled the US and the Netherlands so that you can get some sense. The US is the one within the distrusted in 17 markets. The Netherlands is more trusted. You can see that most of the countries that are trusted seem to be leaning to or actually authoritarian countries. So it could be that distrust in most of these democracies, including the US, is really a reflection of the healthy skepticism that is actually a hallmark of democracies, that we are skeptical of our government, not necessarily totally untrusting of it. Unfortunately, at least in the US, behavior reveals that it's not just a factor of skepticism. Next slide. In fact, if we explore this evidence a little further, we see that no institution is seen as both competent and ethical. And government is seen as low in competence and low in morality. Next slide. These are the percent of people who cite each as a reason they distrust or distrust each institution. It goes from the black serves the interest of only the few to the white serves the interest of everyone equally and fairly. And we can see that government does pretty badly here. It's the worst of government, business, media, and NGOs. Next slide, please. Okay, so what accounts for the variations in assessments of the trustworthiness of government? Well, first of all, I need to make it clear that assessments can be wrong. There can be cognitive mistakes, and as we've seen much too much of recently, there can be serious sources of misinformation that people come to believe. It's also important to emphasize that assessments are contextual. They're affected by different relationships to the government and different treatment by the government. So there's very good reason for certain groups within the polity to lack confidence in government. We've seen that Black Americans, for example, have real reasons to lack confidence in the police, in the medical profession. And the current polarization in the US is that it's polarization. Not everyone has the same assessment. Next slide. This is some evidence about the ways in which people misperceive reality. Now, we know that crime rates have risen actually in this last year, but until that, they had fallen since the early 1990s and quite significantly. Next slide. But the public perception was totally at odds with reality. So we have a deep misperception problem that goes beyond the active misinformation campaigns we have been seeing recently. Next slide. One thing I learned at a recent meeting I attended was public health moves at the rate of trust was the language that was used at the meeting. And next slide. This is from the Kaiser Family Foundation did a survey of what's going on in terms of the vaccination process. And we see that many Black and Hispanic adults who also lack confidence in government and other domains lack confidence that the vaccine development process is actually taking their needs into account. And this is something that is based not just on misinformation, but on their experience. This is context as well as information, though information may be an important way to deal with it. Next slide. Now, there are many reasons for variations in judgment, as I've mentioned, including cognitive reasons. My focus in my work is on the social and political construction of beliefs about how the world works and what you can do about it. Sources of information and the credibility of those sources is clearly part of the story, but it's only part of the story. It's not the whole story. Governance arrangements and policies and practices can have a huge impact. Part of my research looked at the difference in the way in which the Francophones versus the Anglophones in Canada responded to World War I and World War II. The Francophones had no reason to have confidence in the Canadian government, federal government, which had consistently made promises it hadn't kept, which was going to organize an army, have wars and conscription when Canada itself was not under attack. And so they resisted conscription, they voted against it and refused to sign up for the military, versus the Anglophones who acted in the opposite way. In a book I did with John Alquist, In the Interest of Others, this is a more positive story. So the Francophones versus the Anglophones shows the ways in which disunity was actually fed by the actions of the government. In the Interest of Others, which looks at some unions, which are sort of mini governments, we look at the ways in which governance arrangements vary, so that there are some that actually promote cooperation, compliance, not only with the union, but actually encourage the kind of moral behavior and virtues and values that Benjamin Franklin advocated, so that people whose self-interest would tell them not to engage in costly actions on behalf of far distant others do in fact engage in costly actions to support those they may never meet and who can never reciprocate. They closed the longshore workers closed the docks on behalf, for example, in the 1930s of the Chinese who had been invaded in Manchuria by the Japanese, and refused to send the longshore workers on the West Coast and in Australia, refused to send scrap iron to Japan, fearful of a new war. Recent work I'm doing on creating a new moral political economic framework builds on the insights about governance arrangements to think about how we can actually restructure some of what we do in the United States and elsewhere to be a fairer, more trustworthy set of government arrangements. Next slide. So let's go back to our original three terms. What we've learned from my work and the work of many others is the trust of leaders combined with their demonstrated trustworthiness and legitimacy gives them the right to try to persuade, which is a democratic form of power. The trustworthiness of institutions, both objectively and as perceived, allow individuals to engage in the debates and challenges that are prior conditions to informed and democratic decisions and action. And we document that in the interest of others. The result is shared legitimating beliefs about what the government can ask of its members and the conditions under which they are willing to go along with those demands. That's my last slide, but I don't want to end there because all of these three features are all been significantly broken during the past 4 years. Trustworthiness of our institutions, I would argue, is the least damaged, although certainly weakened. But as we saw in the last months, the courts and Congress so far have withheld the siege on them. I don't think the situation is hopeless, though it's terrible right now. We in the United States have seen our institutions and our trust and trustworthiness of our government broken as badly or worse. The revolution that Franklin lived through had to deal with loyalists as well as with Britain. We saw the Civil War. The pre and even early New Deal was subject to this kind of polarization. Al Smith, who ran for president on the Democratic ticket before FDR did, was subject to conspiracy theories about Catholics that no one seemed to be able to change their minds about. McCarthyism. My mother, who lived through the Great Depression and World War II and foresaw Trumpism and died as it began, described McCarthyism as the scariest period of her life. And I've lived through not only McCarthyism as a child, but civil rights and the Vietnam War. There is a solution, and that is common project and purpose. And there are lots of candidates for those common purposes and projects. And some hope that the Biden-Harris presidency can manage and re-earn the confidence of at least a significant portion, if not the majority of the country, by focusing on what we need to do together. Is that utopian in this very divided time? Perhaps, but it's not impossible as history has shown us. This too has happened before. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret Levy. It's now my great honor to introduce Kenneth Frazier. He has been chairman and CEO of Merck since 2011. He was born and raised in Philadelphia, and he's played a role in previous Franklin birthday celebrations. He spoke in 2009 about Merck's role in fighting river blindness when we honored Dr. Roy Vagelos with that year's theme of contributing after retiring. He's a member of the American Philosophical Society, a great American leader and visionary. Please join me in welcoming Kenneth Frazier.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm delighted to join all of you on the 315th anniversary of the birth of Benjamin Franklin and to celebrate this early American leader's legacy as well as his relevance in our world today. Congratulations to Dr. Kathleen Jameson for her distinction as this year's Franklin Founder Award honoree. Her leadership of Fact Check and many other contributions are vital as we learn to embrace the value of social media and improve the accuracy of all of our public communications. I thank Don Smith and all the organizers who helped create this wonderful event, and I thank you in particular for including me. Benjamin Franklin had a profound impact on the evolution of our country and the larger world. His legacy has influenced both the highest echelons of society and the most ordinary people. He was a statesman, an author, a publisher, a scientist, an inventor, a diplomat, and even a deputy postmaster. But above all, he was a highly successful and trusted businessman who left his fortune to the cities of Boston and Philadelphia. Which brings me to the primary topic of today, which is trust in business. We can learn many lessons by exploring the basis for the trust in Benjamin Franklin's printing business, trust that certainly did not evolve by accident. Rather, Franklin intentionally built trust on the foundation of his core values and enhanced it through the principles that characterize his professional and personal interactions. These principles offer insights into how we might improve trust in our own businesses in the context of the contemporary challenges we face today. First is the principle of achieving business sustainability. It may seem obvious, but Franklin knew that trustworthy businesses had to be commercially viable and achieve sustained reliability in delivering their products, in his case, accurate, important, and interesting information that customers needed and wanted. He also understood the importance of adapting his offerings, sometimes at significant financial risk, as new and unexpected customer needs arose. For example, when he realized that the population of German-speaking immigrants in Philadelphia was increasing and constituted about a third of his market, he initiated a publication at considerable financial risk of the first German language newspaper in the colonies to help them integrate into the community. A second basis for trust is the principle of moral leadership. Franklin understood that trusted business leaders are guided by core values. Of course, we can recall the famous Poor Richard's Almanac that translated his core values in a way that entertained and enlightened a wide audience in the colonies. But underneath the lighthearted wisdom he popularized, Franklin was serious about those values: ambition, honesty, hard work, and frugality, among others. He took great pains to not just talk about them, but bring them to life, for example, by making visible his own long hours and even overnight stays at work. He understood that his personal behavior and business trust were inextricably linked. In other words, his credibility and that of his business would suffer if he didn't walk the walk and talk the talk, as we now say. A third principle that underpins trust in business is commitment to economic opportunity. Franklin demonstrated this by developing his own workers and creating franchise ownership opportunities for the successful apprentices who wanted to create their own publishing business in other communities. This leads us to the fourth principle that engendered trust in Franklin's business, his community engagement. In a sense, he was a one-man chamber of commerce. For example, he sponsored a network of erudite collaborators called the Junto that met every Friday. Their deliberations motivated the creation of night watchmen, the volunteer fire department, and public lending libraries. And finally, Franklin was perhaps our nation's first business leader to demonstrate CEO activism. He stood strong for the issues that concerned him and took bold action. He used the power of his pen to influence the pending policy decision to increase the amount of circulating paper currency in the colonies. And although he had owned 2 slaves, he eventually freed them and became president of the abolitionist group known as the Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and the Relief of Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. Today, Franklin's leadership legacy and the lessons about trust could not be more relevant. For we are facing an unprecedented trust deficit across multiple sectors of our society. According to a survey conducted by the Pew Research Center last summer, only 20% of American adults say they trust the federal government to do the right thing just about always or most of the time. Likewise, Americans' trust in mass media to report the news fairly and accurately has been persistently low for over a decade. A Gallup poll last summer indicated that 60% of adult Americans have not very much trust or none at all. The Pew Research Center does report somewhat better news for scientists. Last summer, 38% of Americans indicated that they had a lot of trust in scientists to do what is right for the public. Unfortunately, that trust in science has not diminished the public's hesitancy towards vaccines, a topic that Dr. Offit will explore in depth. So what about trust in businesses? The January 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer provided a worrisome picture. Only half of Americans stated that they trusted businesses to do what is right. Since these polling data were obtained, our nation has been thrust into an unprecedented firestorm of complex societal issues. We're experiencing the worst respiratory disease pandemic in the last 100 years. The pandemic has led to huge economic and personal disruption in terms of job losses, food and housing insecurity, and mental and emotional distress. Concurrently, we have been forced to confront long-standing systemic racism as it manifests in myriad ways across our society. The depravity of the brutal killings of African Americans and the extreme disparity in COVID-19 incidence and mortality rate among people of color. And if these challenges were not enough, we're still reeling from one of the most contentious elections in our history, culminating in the terrorist assault on our nation's capital, the citadel of our democracy, that was incited by our president and fueled by the intense bipartisanship that now characterizes our politics. I meant to say the intense partisanship. Perhaps out of desperation, the American public seems to be turning to employers for solutions. According to Just Capital, 9 in 10 Americans believe that this is the time for companies to foster an economy that serves the interests of workers, customers, communities, and the environment, not just shareholders, and addresses the growing economic disparities that underpin many of our social issues. 3/4 of surveyed adults believe that large companies have a major role in preserving and protecting our democracy. In short, Americans have high expectations of corporations and their leaders. In this context, I believe that business leaders have not just an opportunity, but a duty to step forward and help restore trust in our institutions. But what can we do to accomplish this? Well, perhaps we can learn from the approach that worked for Benjamin Franklin. Let me present a few examples to illustrate this, starting with the first principle, stepping up to help solve emerging needs, even at financial risk. The biopharmaceutical industry as a whole is an exemplar of urgent invention at risk. More than 200 pandemic countermeasures, including vaccines, antivirals, and immunologics, are in various stages of development, some already authorized by the FDA. In addition, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars have been invested to accelerate development and manufacturing of these products at considerable financial risk, so that if the products prove to be useful, they can be supplied to people around the world as soon as possible. Investing at risk in life-saving products is one dimension of moral leadership. Another is the commitment to patients who need their routine medicines and vaccines despite the pandemic, which requires us to invest significant new resources to optimize a safe work environment for the essential workers on site in manufacturing plants and laboratories. Companies are also increasing their commitment to another of Franklin's principles, creating economic opportunity. For example, a startup called 110 is a new national initiative that I helped co-found, and 37 major company CEOs have committed to it. Its aim is to combine the power of American companies to upskill, hire, and promote at least 1 million Black Americans into family-sustaining jobs over the next 10 years. Corporations have a long tradition of supporting their local communities, and their corporate social responsibility programs have evolved to new levels of impact and urgency during this year of multiple crises. The special importance of the 2020 election prompted many companies to take new actions in support of our democracy, making it easier for employees to vote or directing political donations towards candidates whose platforms explicitly support upholding our democracy. Corporate philanthropic efforts that target health disparities among communities of color most vulnerable to COVID-19 have also been expanded. And this leads me to the final pillar of corporate trust that Benjamin Franklin employed in his business, CEO activism. 2/3 of Americans polled by Just Capital in 2020 expect CEOs across America to speak out about divisive issues that are not necessarily directly related to their business priorities, and some are doing just that. The reasons for doing so are varied, and they are not without risk. Usually, they reflect the personal values and beliefs of individual CEOs, a response to the expectation of workers, customers, and other stakeholders, a desire to establish a particular image or brand, or simply situational outrage at egregious violations of social justice, environmental protection, or humanitarian conduct. In the context of our most recent crisis in our nation's capital, the outpouring of CEO statements was rapid and unprecedented in scale. I can't say what net impact this or any advocacy will have on trust in the businesses whose leaders took a public stance, but I have to believe that Ben Franklin was right. Standing up for one's core values is never wrong, and business leaders do have a moral responsibility to advocate for the things that matter in a democratic and just society. I hope I have persuaded you that companies across America are embracing their responsibilities and taking bold steps to help address the social crises we currently face. Time will tell if our collective efforts will help calm the perfect storm we are experiencing and ultimately enhance the trust Americans have in us. I am optimistic, and here is why. I'm the CEO of a company like many others whose founders 125 years ago built an important business on a foundation of trust. Our business entails that patients use medicines and vaccines administered by physicians, trusting that they will alleviate their diseases while knowing the potential adverse effects. That trust has been and always will be our single most important asset. Without it, there can be no employment, no invention, no investment, no market, and no potential for solving the great unmet medical needs of the world. We must now embrace the moral responsibility to help end our current crises and lead the way to a safer, healthier, more just, and more inclusive society. But the moral leadership to do so requires the courage to face hard decisions that must consider the interests of many, often competing stakeholders. Those who are guided by a just moral compass have proven to be not only among the most successful leaders, but also the greatest instigators of progress and reforms that have lasting impacts on society. Much like the stately gentleman we are here to celebrate today. Our country and the world desperately need moral leadership. I'm sure we share a deep commitment to moving our society forward beyond the coronavirus pandemic, beyond the social injustices in our society, and beyond the threats to the very foundation of our democracy. We can inspire human progress and be a source of hope and healing, and together we can and must restore trust. Thank you for your generous listening.
Thank you so much, Ken Frazier, for an inspiring talk about the central importance of moral leadership and how CEOs can be uplifted by Ben Franklin's example and provide a calming and steady voice for the challenges that face America. It's now my honor to introduce Paul Offit. Along with Fred Clark and Stanley Plotkin, he is the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine. He is professor of vaccinology and pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and the director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Dr. Offit is the author of many books on vaccines and antibiotics. He's a leading public advocate for childhood immunizations. And during this pandemic, Dr. Offit has been a member of the FDA's Advisory Committee for COVID vaccine approvals. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Offit.
So thank you, Jeffrey, for that kind introduction. What I want to talk about is a subject that is on all of our minds, which is restoring confidence in vaccines, specifically the COVID-19 vaccines. So here are reasonable things that people could be concerned about. One is the language that surrounds this vaccine with phrases like warp speed, race for a vaccine, who will be the first to cross the finish line. I think that scared people. If you look at a typical vaccine timeline, which includes sort of going from dose ranging trials to larger phase 2 trials, ultimately to large phase 3 trials, that usually takes about 15 to 20 years. The time that it took us to make a rotavirus vaccine was about 26 years. Yet for this vaccine, there was a publication in Science in January of 2020, which was really the first isolation and then genetic characterization of this virus. That was only in January a year ago. Yet within 1 year, we've had 2 large phase 3 trials that have been performed. And I think people seeing it being done that quickly can't help but believe that there were critical phases that were cut, or worse, that safety guidelines were being ignored. I think the reasons that we're seeing this being done so fastly is that groups like BARDA, the World Health Organization, and the Gates Foundation have given what the Centers for Vaccine Research estimates has been about $24 billion on developing the vaccines. And the U.S. government, for the most part, at least for many of these companies, has taken the risk out of vaccine development for pharmaceutical companies by paying the hundreds of millions of dollars for phase 3 trials and paying the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars for mass production at risk, not knowing whether the vaccine is safe, not knowing whether it's going to be effective, and a willingness to throw out millions of doses of vaccines if it wasn't shown to be safe or effective. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think another reason is basically a distrust of the Trump administration. I think the experiences with hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma, both of which at the time were permitted for use under emergency use authorization, and neither had been shown to work. In fact, hydroxychloroquine doesn't work and has been shown in 10% of people to cause heart problems. There was a concern then that the FDA was acting at the behest of the administration instead of protecting Americans from products that were either unsafe or ineffective or both. In fact, as a consequence of that, some states, as well as one professional group, the National Medical Association, stated that they were going to form their own expert advisory committees to evaluate vaccines. They didn't trust the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, on which I sit, because they fear that we were being unduly influenced by the administration. Nonetheless, if you look at what's happened here, we have done 2 large phase 3 trials. In the case of Moderna, 30,000. In the case of the Pfizer group, 44,000. That's typical for any pediatric vaccine. I mean, the human papillomavirus vaccine trial was a 30,000 person trial. The conjugated pneumococcal vaccines were roughly 35,000 person trial. So it is no different. So if that's true, why do we have to approve these through emergency use authorization? Wouldn't it have just made sense for the companies to submit a biologics license application and obtain a license? The main reason really has nothing to do with safety. It really has everything to do with efficacy. Usually the FDA would not approve a vaccine that had only been tested for a few months. Because we've done safety testing 2 months after the last dose, we can say that we've held this to the standard of safety that is typical. But we've only shown these vaccines are effective for 3 or 4 months. I mean, the HPV vaccine trial was a 7-year study. Our rotavirus vaccine trial was a 4-year study. That said, you're not going to do a 2 or 3 or 4-year trial of these vaccines before release, because more than almost 400,000 people have died this year from this virus. So you're willing to accept a certain amount of uncertainty regarding efficacy, which I think is frankly very little, given these vaccines induce T-cell immunity, which suggests that there will be a decent memory response, so suggesting longer-term immunity. And I think we now know that these vaccines didn't cause a relatively uncommon side effect, severe side effect before approval. And now that almost 10 million doses are out there, I think we can say with some comfort that at least for the moment, it doesn't seem to have caused even a rare serious side effect. I think another reason that people are frightened reasonably about these vaccines is that the messenger RNA vaccines that are out there are a novel platform. There's no commercial experience with these vaccines. So I think people can feel like they're being guinea pigs. But again, you're always weighing, the choice not to get a vaccine is not a risk-free choice. It's just a choice to take a different, and in this case, more serious risk. So I think in terms of sort of countering fears and promoting confidence, what we have to do for, I think, the vaccine skeptic is let people know what the data are, be honest about what we know, and humble about what we don't know. I mean, it is a little frightening in a sense, all of this. When this virus raised its head in Wuhan, in November of 2019, it was billed as a winter respiratory virus. It was a virus that was going to come up in the winter, go away in the summer, and cause pneumonia. Well, it is far more than that. I mean, it's a virus that we know can affect blood vessels, causing vasculitis, inflammation of blood vessels, and therefore can cause strokes and heart attacks and kidney disease and liver disease. We know that it can affect your sense of taste and smell for weeks. We know that the virus has been detected by some neuropathologists in the brain. I mean, what winter respiratory virus does that? Even more remarkable, it causes a disease in children that I haven't ever seen before, this multi-system inflammatory disease that it seems to be unique to children. And in addition, although it is a virus that is spread by small droplets and it is an envelope virus where you would expect it wouldn't do well in hot and humid climates, this past summer, it still was able to rage at some level in places like Florida and Texas. So this is not your typical respiratory virus. And how are we meeting this? How are we going to meet this challenge? We're meeting this challenge with a vaccine strategy, messenger RNA, with which we have no commercial experience. I am sure it is likely that over the next year or two, we are going to learn things that we wish we knew now. And so we have to be humble about that. I mean, nature gives up its secrets slowly, grudgingly, and often with a human price. And I think that is something we have to be honest about as we move forward. But the good news is there is in place the CDC has with its vaccine adverse events reporting system, where its vaccine safety data link, with its so-called vSafe system, a number of systems in place that are going to pick up any rare serious side effects should they occur. So this is all something we're always going to be looking at because we know that we don't know everything. We know we need to be open-eyed to the fact that there may be things we're going to find that we don't know now. I think that the next group would be what I would call the vaccine cynic. I mean, these are people who are frankly conspiracy theorists. They believe that the pharmaceutical world controls everything, that they control the government, that they control the medical establishment, and they're frankly just not going to believe what you have to say. And so they're very difficult to convince. I think the probably best example was a movie that was released by the anti-vaccine activists. And when I say anti-vaccine activists, I'm talking about the conspiracy theorists. On May 4th, 2020, it was called Plandemic, and it featured a number of false claims. For example, that hydroxychloroquine cured COVID-19, which it doesn't, that SARS-CoV-2 was manipulated to create a pandemic strain, that the influenza vaccine increases the chance of getting COVID-19, that influenza vaccine contains SARS-CoV-2, that microbes in the ocean cure COVID-19, that wearing a protective mask activates the virus, that Bill Gates created SARS-CoV-2 pandemic so that he could make money selling vaccines to prevent it. Presumably $60 billion wasn't enough. The COVID-19 death statistics have been manipulated to control the public. And you listen to this and you think, well, this is obviously absurd. No one's going to pay attention to this. Nonetheless, this movie was viewed by 8 million people in the first week. So this is at some level influential. I mean, I think the anti-vaccine people, the conspiracy theorists, have been pretty much marginalized. They've gotten louder, meaner. I think the mainstream media really no longer pays attention to them. And so they have been driven to the social media where they certainly have influence. So I guess I'll close here. I think that regarding trying to convince the anti-vaccine activists, the conspiracy theorists that they're wrong, I would use the Neil deGrasse Tyson quote, which is, quote, "You can't use logic or reason to convince someone out of an argument that they didn't use logic or reason to formulate."
Thank you so much, Dr. Offit, for a clarifying and important talk, and also for your crucial service in helping develop and spread the vaccine and in contributing to national vaccine policy. It is very, very much appreciated, and we're privileged to learn from you. Now is the time for questions from our audience, and I'm going to read the questions that have been put in the chat box. And the first question is to Margaret. Is our current lack of trust new, or have there been earlier instances? Is it cyclical in our history?
I wouldn't call it is not new. We have a problem using the survey material because it only dates back to the late 1950s, early 1960s, which are arguably among our higher trust periods, at least as measured by those kinds of surveys. But as I said, if we look at behavior and we look at context, we see that there have been many periods in our history when the institutions of government have not been trusted, when the politicians have not been trusted. And there certainly are continuing, I wouldn't call this cyclical, there are continuing groups within the polity who, either for the conspiratorial reasons that Dr. Offit was just talking about, or because of absolutely real factors that have affected them. African Americans, Black Americans have good reason to distrust governments, local and federal. So this is not a new phenomenon at all. This is something that continually happens in the United States and elsewhere. The intensity of it at the moment, and the groups that are engaging in practices like storming the Capitol, is not something that normally happens, though we certainly see very dedicated demonstrations and activists throughout many periods of our history. But this is a particularly intense moment, I'd say, but not totally new and part of the fabric of the United States, which has always been a very contested polity.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask Dr. Offit a question, but in the meantime, let me remind our audience that you can input questions into YouTube, and I will pose them to our panelists. The next question, well, in fact, I'm going to stay in the order of our speakers, and the next question is to Ken Frazier. Will things change in corporate practices longer term since the insurrections in Washington?
You know, I don't know that they will change long term. I know that in the short term, many companies are rethinking their political contributions overall. Many of them are thinking about specifically whether we want to support those people who I would say sort of cynically supported the notion that the election was not a fair and free election and are therefore viewed by some companies as being undemocratic. For sure, that's the kind of thing that companies will do in the short run. I think over the longer term, I think companies will have to take a step back and say, how do we participate in the political system with our contribution? I think the real issue for companies is that when we go to the seat of government, we should not go to the seat of government solely for things that are in our self-interest. I think if there are, in fact, enlightened companies and CEOs, we ought to go to our government and petition for some of the issues that are serious issues in our society around law enforcement, about education reform, about healthcare disparities, around employment for broader groups of people. So I would hope that what would change is the agenda that we take when we deal with the government.
You know, I have to say that is such a Franklin-like and important response to our national challenges. As you say, corporate leaders can play such an important role in convincing people to go to Washington, not for selfish, but for public purposes, and also for insisting on a shared understanding of facts, and when there are false facts, to have consequences for politicians who embrace them. Thank you for your leadership in envisioning that. The next questions are to Dr. Offit, and I see at least two. Can you talk more about the long-term effects of the COVID vaccine, and also why is the rollout of the vaccine so slow? Sorry, you're muted again, as you said.
Okay, sorry. In terms of long-term effects of the vaccine, I mean, I'll choose to take the positive view of that. I think that this vaccine is likely to induce immunological memory. You have an incubation period from when you're first exposed to the virus to when you develop symptoms of about 6 days, which is plenty of time for activation and differentiation of memory cells. So I think this vaccine these vaccines are likely to be effective for a few years, if I had to make a guess. In terms of safety issues, I'm open-minded. Let's look at the data as they come in. I'm encouraged by what happened in the pre-approval trials. I'm encouraged by the fact that we've already had almost 10 million doses out there, so I think that's good. What was the second part of the question, Jeffrey?
The long-term effect of the vaccine and why has the rollout been so slow?
Right, rollout slow. So, I think you really have to give credit to the Trump administration for making a vaccine this quickly. It's remarkable. I think if you had asked 1,000 scientists in January 2020, do you think we will have done 2 large clinical trials with mRNA vaccines that show that these vaccines are 95% effective against disease, 95% effective in people over 65, 95% or more in people who have to prevent serious disease across all comorbidities, across all racial and ethnic backgrounds? No one would have said yes. So you have to give them credit for that. When they mass produced this vaccine at risk, I wish what they'd done at the same time was realized how hard it is to mass vaccinate. We don't have a public health system in place to do mass vaccination. We are learning that on the fly. And you'll see some states are already better at it than others. I mean, when you see, for example, in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Convention Center is now open for vaccination. Dodger Stadium is now open for vaccination. I think as we get vaccine out there and we get better at mass vaccination, I think we can get to the 1 million to 1.5 million people that are going to need to be vaccinated every day if we're to stop the spread of this virus by the summer. We just weren't good at. We're still learning how to. It's three stages, right? Mass production, mass distribution, and mass administration, and we're certainly bad at the administration part. Witness, less than a third, I think, of the vaccine that's out there, that's distributed, has been given. We'll get there.
Many thanks for that, and for that note of optimism. Margaret, I think 2 questions for you. How is it possible that the stock market booms while we're suffering the worst pandemic in modern history? And also a question is about what can boots on the ground scientists and engineers do to regain trust? How does one engage in a meaningful way to people who are doubters?
I may defer the question about the stock market to Kenneth, but the stock market operates on a different set of principles. It has to do with what John Maynard Keynes called animal spirits, as much as it has to do with reason. So it's a complicated process, but it has often been out of alignment with public perceptions of what the polity is doing. In terms of what people can do, what boots on the ground can do as scientists, engineers, as citizens, is I really think the best thing we can do is we've just gotten an example from Paul of the problems that we're facing, for example, in mass vaccination. This is a common project. This is something that we're all part of. So we have to demonstrate, and all of us can help with that. By getting vaccinated if we're eligible, when we're eligible to, by participating in the process, by helping, by recognizing that this is something that isn't just a government responsibility, but a citizenship responsibility, just as we mobilize voters in order to really be engaged in the polity, we need to mobilize citizens to recognize what they have to do and what we have to do collectively to help ensure public safety and public health.
Thank you very much for that. Ken Frazier, you can talk about the stock market if you like. I know you have great insights on that, but there are a bunch of questions about your extremely important call to the corporate community to exercise moral leadership. And one of our questioners asks, have you felt much pushback from others in the corporate community? And how can corporations ensure that they exercise more moral leadership without getting involved in politics?
Those are two very good questions. So the first one is I've not felt much pushback at all on the issues, particularly around the election and supporting our democracy. I do think that CEOs don't have a right, much less a responsibility, to tell people how they should think about partisan political issues. I think that CEOs need to take a step back and ask themselves, are there issues around our shared values as a country and as a civilized world? And if we're supporting those kinds of issues, like, for example, the concept that people should be given accurate information, the concept that we want to suppress any hatred or bigotry in our society, then I don't think of those as being political issues. I think of those as being issues that go to our stated creeds as a collection of rational, tolerant, hopefully enlightened people who come from different backgrounds and make up this experiment called America. On the stock market question, I would just simply say a couple of things. So first of all, prior economic recessions have tended to affect people across the board. This pandemic-caused recession has picked out certain groups. So it has disproportionately affected people who are on the lower income side of the economic spectrum. And the stock market goes up because often those of us who are privileged to have certain jobs and certain kinds of income, we actually aren't being hurt by the pandemic, at least not to the extent that people on the lower side of the economic spectrum are. I think that's one more reason why business has to work, ensure that our economy is fair. I don't think we want to live in a country where we have such a wide gap between the haves and the have-nots. And I think what the pandemic has shown is it's unmasked the underlying unfairness of our system economically, in terms of the health disparities that affect people of color, and that's why they die more often. And so the answer to the question is that the stock market is reacting to the fact that the pandemic hasn't affected everyone. It hasn't affected those of us who are on the upper side of the spectrum. Many businesses have thrived because they're new businesses, the Zooms of the world that we're using right now, their stocks has gone up because we're using their equipment and their systems much more. But I think fundamentally, what the stock market going up in the middle of a pandemic shows is the huge economic disparities that we've tolerated in our country. And I think if we're not careful, the center will not hold.
Wow, that quotation from Yeats is so powerful. The best lack all intention, but the worst are full of passionate intensity. The center will not hold. And your defense of reason as the standard, the nonpartisan reason that the corporate community can converge around, is extremely powerful. Dr. Offit, two questions to you. First, should the millions of people who have had COVID-19 feel safe in the short term? And the second one that my kids, and I know many of ours, are really asking, should schools be open?
Right. So if you've been previously infected, I think you are, in all likelihood, immune. And I think you are likely immune for, I would imagine, a few years. I mean, if you look at the studies that were done by Shane Crotty at UCal San Diego, natural infection induces, fairly high frequencies of memory B and T cells. That's a good sign. So I think that's true. That said, the CDC still recommends those who've been previously infected be vaccinated. The Pfizer didn't distinguish previously infected or not previously infected in their trial, and there was some benefit based on small numbers, but there was some benefit clearly in getting a vaccine as compared to not getting a vaccine in people who've been previously infected, presumably because there was a booster response. Also remember that when you look on CNN and it says like 23 million people have been infected, that's people who've been tested and found to be infected. I think that number is clearly low. Studies that were done in November showed that when they did antibody surveillance studies, which is a much more sensitive way of figuring out who really has been infected, that was off by then a factor of 4. I think Now it's probably a factor of 3. So there's probably 65 to 70 million people who've already been infected, which is about 20% of the population. So when we talk about trying to get vaccine out there, remember about 20% of the population is already protected, largely protected. So that's good. Again, another reason I think we can get on top of this sooner than people can hope. In terms of schools, right? So you're going to get me in trouble here. I think that. I think that we can go back to school. I do. I mean, certainly other countries have gone back to school. You just have to do the things that they're doing, for example, at parochial schools in Philadelphia, which is make sure that everybody wears a mask, make sure that people, that you space the desks, make sure that it's not the students that go from one classroom to the next, it's the teacher that goes. Teachers are now an essential group, so they should be soon getting these vaccines. With that, I think you would be able to go back to school safely, because I mean it is absolutely true that virtual learning is not the same thing as on-site learning, and certainly some of these children, it's the only decent meal they get during the day. It's often the place where child abuse is identified. I mean, we are losing a lot here by not going to school, and I think when teachers want to be considered essential workers, and they are essential workers, I think they need to go to work and do the kinds of things that were done in Denmark that enabled them to go to have school and not suffer that choice. So if anybody wants to know my email, so you can send me hate mail if you're a teacher, offit@email.chop.edu.
Well, Hugo and Sebastian Rosen will send you a note of appreciation. And indeed, I think that in President-elect Biden's recovery speech yesterday, there are substantial funds that he hopes to devote to opening at least K through 8 schools in the coming months. I think we have time for one round of questions for each of our 3 panelists in this excellent discussion. Dr. Levy, the first one is to you. What are some of the common projects that the incoming Biden and Harris administration might consider implementing to restore general trust in our democratic institutions and greater unity?
Well, there's so many of them. We're in a moment that reminds me very much of what happened during the New Deal, where there were just a myriad of choices and selections in order to deal with some of the problems that Kenneth Frazier just mentioned, most notably the things that are causing the incredible inequality and the incredible extent of distrust of the government. What I'm really interested in seeing is building what we call, beyond common project, something called an expanded community of fate, F-A-T-E, not faith, fate, where people really recognize that their destinies are intertwined and that they have to work together to make changes. That's point one. And we have a whole list of things in which that needs to be done, from public health to food security, to unemployment and various forms of social insurance that have to be revised. When you look at many of our institutions that deal with those things, they were designed in the 1930s during the New Deal, and they're now over almost 100 years old. So we really have to rethink everything, from old age insurance and Social Security to unemployment insurance, et cetera. The other thing that comes to mind is an example that I'll draw from Australia, which is at one point in the late 70s and 1980s, there was serious distrust of government due to the fact that the tax system had become remarkably unfair, and that there were certain people getting away with all kinds of things, while workers and poor people always had to pay their taxes, and there were others who seemed to be exempt who could easily afford to pay their taxes. So the way it was dealt with when Bob Hawke became prime minister was to reconsider the whole tax system, to basically have a Philadelphia moment, a constitutional convention, as it were, around the tax system, involving lots and lots of different publics with lots of different opinions, in a series of town halls and meetings and actual actions and provisions in terms of the tax system. So we need to go through our various policies and institutions, and the ones where there is serious distrust for good reason, because there are people who are inequitably and unfairly treated, or who are not getting what they need, and build a community of fate around that, and a kind of Philadelphia moment around that.
A community of fate and a Philadelphia moment. What a powerful charge to our audience. Ken Frazier, we have a broad question, and it leads me to pose it this way. The kind of capitalism practiced in the US today, short-term, shareholder, primary, externalizing costs, is antithetical to what Franklin practiced. Can corporate America be more Franklinian? And you've just given us such an inspiring example of corporate moral leadership in the Franklin spirit. I wonder whether you think that there are future moments of national unreason where large communities of people accept facts that aren't true, where the corporate community should come together and make clear what the facts are and that there will be consequences for not embracing them.
So let me first start by saying how honored I was to share this opportunity with Dr. Levy and Dr. Offit. I think corporations have huge influence, and I think it's really important right now that corporations deal with both the issues that you talked about. I think if we continue to ask ourselves, how do we run corporations solely as, if you will, means to create wealth creating machines, if you will, for a small number of people, I think we will find ourselves in a situation where we not only will have less public trust, but the economy, the political system upon which we depend, the rule of law, all of those things will begin to crumble. I think we should look at what happened this week in the Capitol and realize that as a public, we would always say, cling to the belief that that couldn't happen in the United States. Well, it did happen in the United States, and I think that's a reflection of just how fragile our political system can be. And to the point about misinformation, I think it's very important for all of us not to judge other people who have different political views than us in a negative way. I think that's one of the bad things about our society is people say, if you don't agree with my political view, you become my enemy. So I think we need more healing. I think we need more unity, but never at the cost of not pointing out what's truthful and what's untruthful fundamentally. Our democracy depends on people having accurate information. And I think the business community and all leaders in civil society ought to call out those people, whether they're the anti-vax people that Dr. Offit talked about, or some of the cynical political people who feel that their ambitions will in fact be advanced by fundamentally telling people lies. We ought to call them out and we ought to hold them accountable.
Such a powerful distinction between legitimate difference of opinion and unreasoned rejection of facts, and your bipartisan call for calling out the anti-vax and the anti-election people is galvanizing, and I'm so grateful to you for your leadership. Thank you, Ken Frazier. Dr. Offit, the last question is to you. It's a great one, and I know we're all eager for your answer. Any reading recommendations for our audience?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question. I think if we're talking about trying to restore confidence, I mean, those are sort of my sociological, psychological kinds of books that have been written. And there certainly are many books like that. I mean, you know, things like, you know, the death of expertise, the death of truth. I mean, things that talk about how we've gotten here. And then in the last few chapters, at least talk about how we can get out of there. And I think Dr. Levy certainly alluded to a few of those, but I'm not sure I can think of anything specific that answers that. Plus, it's not fair for me to have to follow Ken Frazier after that last answer. That was an amazing answer.
It was. You're absolutely right. Well said. And I'm so grateful to all of you, Margaret Levy, Ken Frazier, and Paul Offit, for a really illuminating celebration of Ben Franklin's birthday. Each of you turned this important moment, the commemoration of the birthday of one of the great founders of America, into a meaningful opportunity to address our current urgent vexations. And you gave us practical advice for how the business community, the scientific community, and the citizens as a whole can restore the self-government, virtue, and rule by reason that Ben Franklin thought necessary. Thanks so much to all of you, and we're going to now take a break, and we will reconvene at 10:35. Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Welcome back. Coming up is a presentation by our 2021 honoree, Dr. Kathleen Hall Jameson. So let me begin my introduction of Kathleen by quoting Marcia McNutt, president of the National Academy of Sciences, who said, "Kathleen Hall Jameson's nonpartisan, evidence-based approach to science communication and political analysis is an invaluable national treasure." Last year, Dr. Jameson was awarded the National Academy of Sciences' highest honor, the Public Welfare Medal, certainly in the Franklin tradition. Dr. Jameson is the Elizabeth Ware Packard Professor of Communications at the Annenberg School of Communications. She is the Walter and Lenore Annenberg Director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of numerous books and the co-founder of factcheck.com. Dr. Jameson is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the American Philosophical Society. And being born in Minneapolis, she strikes me as embodying some of the great American Midwestern characteristics. Therefore, the Benjamin Franklin Birthday Celebration Committee proudly presents its annual Franklin Founder Award to Dr. Kathleen Hall Jameson.
Thank you for this honor. It's one that I will cherish, in particular because it puts me in a line of succession with so many distinguished individuals whose work I so greatly admire. It also provides an opportunity to talk with others today about Benjamin Franklin and his legacy, and in the process to ask how resilient are these democratic institutions, or in Benjamin Franklin's phrase, how well have we kept the republic that was given to us by the founders? You know, the end of December, there was an article in the Associated Press that caught my attention. The headline asked, "What's holding our country together?" A divided nation was asking that in the headline. And in the article, the author said, the foundations of the American experiment have been shaken by partisan rancor, disinformation, a president's assault on democracy, and a deadly coronavirus pandemic. Foundations shaken. Yes. But I would argue that they remain durable because we have an independent judiciary that has protected them. And we have individuals who have across time exercised their constitutionally protected freedoms to secure those for others who were left out of the founding documents. And in their use of the mutually reinforcing freedoms of speech, press, petition, peaceable assembly, they increased opportunities to vote, and in the process helped make real the promises of democracy, in Martin Luther King's phrase, and helped bend the arc of the country's history toward justice. In the process, our courts played a key role. The right to choose the nation's leaders in a fair and free election is a hallmark of a representative system of government. But what good is a right to vote if you can't exercise it, or you exercise it and your vote isn't counted? Because that right is protected by a branch of government that deals in fact and not fabulation, proof and not conjecture, the outcome of the 2020 election was not undone by what judges recognized as, and I quote, speculative accusations unsupported by evidence, and I quote, inadmissible hearsay within hearsay. As Federal District Court Judge Diane Humatua put it when she dismissed a suit in Arizona, allegations that find favor in the public sphere of gossip and innuendo cannot be a substitute for earnest pleadings and procedure in a federal court. In short, the kind of disinformation, rancor, and discord at issue in the AP article have no place in court opinions. Across the country, judges, some nominated to the bench by Republicans, others by Democrats, demonstrated that they are in fact a protection against the lure of the irregular passion and the power of artful misrepresentation that James Madison so feared. So with an independent judiciary as a backdrop and the constitutionally protected rights in the First Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote has been one of the objectives of those people who were left out of We the People at the founding. But the press and petition and speech and assembly played an important role in securing that right, and having secured it, in ensuring that those who had been given the right, whose right had been acknowledged, were actually able to use it. The fact that the AP, which is a news organization, has been in existence since 1846, could, without any fear of retribution from the government, identify the behavior of an incumbent president as a factor destabilizing the country's foundations is another sign that their footings are intact. And that First Amendment freedom, freedom of the press, made it possible for journalists to expose the deceptions of leaders about Vietnam, about Watergate, about Iran-Contra, and about the COVID pandemic, to reveal the abuses of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, and to alert the public to the Trump administration's separation of children at the borders. That same constitutional guarantee protected the right of television stations to carry images of the peaceful protesters, including 25-year-old chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, John Lewis, being beaten by Alabama troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965. And in 2020, to carry the tragic images of George Floyd dying under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer. The former propelled enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The latter gave us a new ban on neck restraints in 32 of the 65 largest police departments in the country, and promises of police reform from the person who will assume the presidency on January 20th. The power of an unfettered press also was on display last week when broadcasters documented a president's incitement of violence, a resulting insurrection that profaned the nation's capital, the resolute return of our elected representatives to those chambers, and their confirmation early in the morning that a new president and vice president had indeed been elected. In blogs and editorials, reporters, editors, and outraged members of the public condemned the president's appeals and the mob's actions, as leaders reminded the president that the Constitution contains the means of removing a president from office through impeachment or exercise of the 25th Amendment. With the press as a key way to communicate and petition as a way to establish that large numbers of people are exercising their right to petition the government, we have interlocking rights used well by John Lewis at Selma, used well by Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we celebrate this week, and Benjamin Franklin. All three used their constitutionally protected freedoms to tell the public and those in power, in Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. In the final months of his life, Benjamin Franklin used the right of petition, the power of speech, and the power of press to draw on the language of the founding documents to urge Congress to grant liberty to those degraded into perpetual bondage. Now that effort didn't succeed, but strong people of integrity using their rights persisted. Where the printer, whose birth we celebrate January 17th, dispatched his petition in print, the preacher, born more than 2 centuries later, on January 15th, peaceably assembled more than 250,000 people in front of the Lincoln Memorial on a hot August day in 1963. John Lewis who was on that same stage as King at the '63 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, was just 25 years old when he led the march across the bridge in Selma that changed history. Designed to dramatize the denial of voting rights that had been guaranteed by the 15th and 19th Amendments, but were being subverted in Alabama, the marchers were en route to Montgomery to present their grievance to George Wallace, then the governor. But after a billy club-wielding phalanx of white Alabama troopers interrupted that plan, it was a free press that brought the nation's attention to the grievance and to the outrage perpetrated against those peaceful protesters. Across the nation, stunned families, glued to their television sets, observed peaceful protesters being beaten and Lewis's skull being fractured. When President Lyndon Johnson submitted the Voting Rights Act of '65 to Congress 8 days later, he called Selma a turning point in man's unending search for freedom, and he analogized it to Lexington, to Concord, and to Appomattox. In the process of fighting for equality, the concept of human dignity was added to the national lexicon. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating "for whites only," noted Martin Luther King Jr. at that March on Washington. And the great phrases such as "all men are created equal" and "government by consent of the governed" are a promise to every citizen that he shall share in the dignity of man, said Lyndon Johnson to Congress as he urged passage of the Voting Rights Act in '65. They asked for equal dignity in the eyes of the law, wrote Justice Anthony Kennedy in the majority opinion in the gay marriage case in 2015. The Constitution grants them that right. John Lewis's posthumously published appeal titled "Together You Can Redeem the Soul of Our Nation" saw human dignity as a grounding premise that could transcend divides. Speaking of the protests that followed the deaths of George Floyd, Rashid Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor, he wrote, "Millions of people, motivated simply by human compassion, laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity." Respect for human dignity transcends the divides of gender, and, of special note in these polarized times, should transcend the divides of ideology as well. Those who doubt the resilience of our democratic institutions might recall that, thanks to poll workers, secretaries of state, judges, and federal cyber warriors, the integrity of those ballots was protected in 2020. So what has this to do with the founder whose birth we're celebrating today? Open to evidence and receptive to argument, Franklin came to realize that enslavement was a violation of what Lewis would call human dignity. Ben's reversal on the issue was dramatic. For decades, he'd owned human property. His Pennsylvania Gazette had publicized the sale of enslaved people. Yet, influenced by evidence that young children of color did well when afforded schooling, and hearing the moral aspects and the moral arguments of the case from Quaker abolitionists such as Anthony Benezet, Franklin became president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. And, as I noted a moment ago, in the final months of his life, he petitioned Congress to end that vicious practice. By casting it as the butchery of the human species and the detestable traffic in bodies and souls, Franklin also foreshadowed Lewis's claim that all have the right to human dignity. The humility and habits of mind that Franklin's change in attitude and behavior indicate are ones that in times are really in short supply these days. He said, "When another asserted something that I thought was in error, I denied myself the pleasure of contradicting him abruptly and of showing immediately some absurdity in his proposition, and in answering, I began by observing that in certain cases or circumstances his opinion would be right, but in the present case there appeared or seemed to be some difference. The modest way in which I proposed my opinion, he said, procured them a readier reception and less contradiction. I had less mortification when I was found to be wrong, and I more easily prevailed with others to give up their mistakes and join me when I happened to be in the right. Unsurprisingly, then, it was Franklin who diffused discord in the Constitutional Convention after James Madison violated the norms of the meeting when he attacked the person rather than the policy of those disagreeing with him. He said something to the effect that they hadn't sufficiently analyzed the subject and they were being vague and inconclusive. Hearing that, the elderly diplomat responded by rising and proposing that the delegates reflect on the uniqueness of the problem and seek divine guidance and divine grace. Noted a later commentator, this timely and gracious advice of the aged diplomat produced its desired effect, and the debate resumed the highly impersonal tone of its early stages. Those who doubt that the voices and actions of individuals can help us transcend rancor and discord can turn back to that moment. And they can also remember as well that the major broadcast and cable networks, including MSNBC on the left and Fox News on the right, preempted their regularly scheduled programming to bring us John Lewis's funeral last summer. Alabama troopers saluted as John Lewis's flag-draped casket crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the last time. And Alabama Governor Kay Ivey paid tribute to Lewis's heroism and his enduring legacy. It is our task to preserve that legacy as well.
Good day, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining in the celebration of my birthday. And of course, of my 316 years, this is the first time I've done a virtual greeting. But of course, the reason why we are here is to give praise to our honoree, Kathleen Jameson. So I'd like to send out a celebratory praise to her. Please join me. Huzzah! 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 Good day.